Mia rushed out of the house, her trembling hands clutching tightly at her thin coat. The cold wind howled across the fields, but nothing could stop her from running straight toward the barn. The thick darkness blanketed everything around her, with only the faint glow of the lantern hanging outside the barn casting light like a distant beacon, calling her closer. She halted in front of the heavy wooden door, her heart pounding so violently it felt as if it would burst from her chest. Inside, the soft but deliberate sound of hooves shuffling echoed as if the horse was waiting for her, or perhaps already knew she was coming. Mia pushed the door open. The creak of the hinges sliced through the suffocating silence. Stellan stood there, tall and majestic, his deep black eyes staring directly at her. She swallowed hard, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the horse. The air in the barn felt heavy, as if every breath and every movement carried a significance she couldn't quite explain. "You were waiting for me, weren't you?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper, soft like a confession. Stellan tilted his head slightly, a small gesture that felt like an answer. There was something in his gaze, a profound understanding, a wordless whisper that held Mia frozen in place. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen and truly heard in a way she never had with Ethan. A powerful surge of emotion coursed through her, both comforting and perilous. She reached out her hand, brushing against Stellan's mane, feeling the warmth of his body seep into her fingertips. It was like an electric current running down her spine, and in that moment she realized her life had irreversibly changed. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but Mia no longer noticed. Everything else around her faded into silence. There was only her, Stellan, and a burgeoning secret threading its way through the shadows like a flame poised to ignite. Mia stood still in the barn, her hand resting gently on Stellan's mane, her gaze lost in the distant void. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the scent of dry hay, damp earth, and the warm breath of the horse standing silently beside her. In this tranquil space, she felt as though she had escaped it all: the cold, lifeless house, Ethan's vacant stares, and the gnawing loneliness that had eaten away at her soul for years. Memories rushed over her like a tidal wave. There had been a time when Mia believed love could conquer everything. She and Ethan were once like blazing flames, unstoppable and inseparable. She remembered the first time they met, how Ethan had made her laugh until tears streamed down her face with his wit and natural charm. She recalled the long evenings spent by the fire, sharing dreams of a bright future. Back then, Ethan had promised he would always be by her side, building a life together that they could both cherish. But those promises had become a luxury as the years passed. Ethan had thrown himself into his work. Endless meetings and business trips that stretched so long, Mia could no longer remember the last time they had dinner together without his phone buzzing incessantly. Every time he came home, it was like hosting a stranger. He'd walk in, drop his bag, give her a quick hug, and disappear behind the screen of his laptop. Mia had tried, really tried, to hold on. She had prepared romantic dinners, tried to revive their old conversations, but Ethan always dismissed her with the same weary refrain. "I'm too tired, Mia. Can we talk later?" But later never came. She used to believe that time could heal everything, but instead, it only widened the chasm between them. Ethan wasn't a bad man. He wasn't unfaithful, angry, or neglectful in the conventional sense, but his indifference had made Mia feel like she was slowly fading, becoming a ghost in her own marriage. When Ethan bought Stellan, she thought it was just another fleeting interest of his. but Stellan had become the only bright spot in Mia's otherwise monotonous days. In the horse's deep, soulful eyes, she found a peace she hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't just that. Mia couldn't forget the first time she met Evelyn, the horse trainer Ethan had hired. Evelyn was a formidable woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through every facade and an air of quiet sorrow that hinted at her own wounds. Evelyn didn't speak much, but when she did, her words hit like arrows straight to truths Mia had long avoided. She remembered that afternoon when she and Evelyn stood outside the barn talking about Stellan. Evelyn had looked directly at her, her gaze as though peeling back every layer of Anna's soul, and said a sentence Mia would never forget. "You know, horses like Stellan can sense what humans refuse to admit. Sometimes it's loneliness that forges the strongest bond." At the time, Mia had only smiled politely and brushed it off, but now, as she stood before Stellan, Evelyn's words echoed in her mind, like a prophecy she didn't want to acknowledge. Perhaps Evelyn had been right. It was her loneliness, the emptiness Ethan couldn't fill, that had slowly drawn her closer to Stellan. Step by step, she ran her hand softly through Stellan's mane, feeling the warmth beneath her palm. "You know, Stellan," she whispered, "sometimes I wish I could be a horse like you. No worries, no battles to fight, just freedom." Stellan didn't answer, of course, but his gaze seemed to say he understood. In that moment, Mia felt a fleeting sense of relief, yet deep down she knew everything was changing, and there was no way to turn back. Moonlight stretched across the fields, illuminating the narrow path leading to the barn. Mia walked slowly, step by step, as though an invisible force was pulling her towards Stellan. The wind grew stronger and colder, but she didn't care. Something inside her was stirring, a tempest both vague and overwhelming, as if her heart was urging her towards something her mind couldn't comprehend. The barn door creaked open, the hinges groaning into the stillness of the night. Stellan stood there, his deep, shadowy eyes reflecting the moonlight. In that moment, Maya felt the world around her dissolve. Ethan was gone. The cold, distant phone calls and the lonely, endless evenings had vanished. There was only her and Stellan, as though they belonged to each other in a way that required no explanation. "You were waiting for me again, weren't you?" she whispered, her own voice sounding like a stolen secret. She stepped closer, her hand brushing gently against Stellan's sleek black mane. The horse's warm breath puffed softly against her, soothing and silent like a quiet reassurance. She stroked him, letting her fingers glide over the smooth strands of his coat. The weight in her chest seemed to lift, replaced by a calm so rare it almost felt foreign. But then the moment shifted. Mia couldn't recall what made her do it. Perhaps it was the way Stellan's eyes held hers, or the slight tilt of his head that seemed to acknowledge her touch. Perhaps it was the storm inside her, the loneliness, the yearning, and the hollow void she had been unable to fill. Her hand stopped on the side of his face, her palm pressed gently against his warmth. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, but even that breath trembled. "Stellan," his name slipped from her lips, not as a call, but as a confession. The horse shifted slightly, lowering his head as if in response. The way he stood, motionless yet full of understanding, made Mia feel as though he could read the very thoughts swirling in her mind. His gaze met hers, deep, unjudged, and demanding nothing yet so magnetic she couldn't look away. Her breathing grew heavier as she moved closer, as though the space between them was an unbearable chasm that needed to be bridged. A long moment stretched between them, silent but thick with anticipation. Her hand came to rest on Stellan's chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her fingers. But her own heart was a chaotic drumbeat, threatening to shatter her composure. She stopped thinking for the first time in her life. All reason, all notions of morality, and every voice of logic were silenced. She was left only with the rawness of her emotions, or perhaps a part of her she had repressed for far too long. One small step, a slight lean forward, and Anna's world came crashing down. She was no longer herself, the tired, hollow version of Miash had been, but simply a woman consumed by feelings she had never known before. But then a faint noise broke the spell. Mia jerked back as if she had been yanked out of a fevered dream. A dim beam of light sliced through the barn, and her heart stopped. In that instant, Evelyn stood in the doorway, the sharp-eyed horse trainer's gaze fixed on Mia like a dagger. She didn't say a word, but Miak knew Evelyn had seen everything. The air in the barn felt frozen. Evelyn didn't move, her expression a mix of surprise and cold calculation, as though she was piecing together the scene she had just walked into. Mia opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She could feel her breath rising in the cold night air like an unspoken confession. Shame, guilt, and fear pressed down on her chest. Yet somewhere deep inside, she felt an odd sense of relief, the relief that her secret was no longer hers alone to bear. Evelyn's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. "What do you think you're doing?" The simple question cut through the air like a knife. Evelyn stepped into the barn, her movements slow but purposeful. Mia stumbled back, but Stellan stood unmoving, like an anchor holding her in the eye of the storm. I don't know," Mia stammered, her voice weak and trembling. Evelyn stopped just a few feet from her, her sharp gaze boring into Mia's very soul. "Do you understand where this is heading?" Evelyn asked, her voice low but each word landing like a blow. "You're playing with fire, Mia, and once it burns, there will be nothing left to salvage." Mia couldn't respond. She simply stood there, face to face with Evelyn and the maelstrom of emotions tearing through her. She knew Evelyn was right, knew the truth in her words, but even knowing that, she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she had already crossed a line she once thought she never would. Evelyn stood firmly before Mia, her gaze sharp as a blade. The suffocating tension in the barn thickened, pressing down on Mia until she felt she couldn't breathe. She couldn't avoid Evelyn's eyes, couldn't deny what had just happened, and couldn't muster any excuse to justify her actions. "Did you really think this would stay a secret?" Mia's voice trembled as she replied, "I didn't mean to." Evelyn let out a short, sharp laugh tinged with bitter irony. "Mia, this isn't something that just happened. This is a choice, and you know exactly what you're doing." Evelyn's words struck Mia like a blow to the chest, but instead of feeling regret, she felt herself being pushed to the edge of a precipice. The storm inside her, shame, anger, and even desperate longing, swelled, threatening to break free. "Why do you care, Mia?" she snapped, her voice louder than she intended, almost a shout. "This is my life. You have no idea what I've been through. You don't know how lonely I am." Evelyn's expression didn't waver. "You're right. I don't know everything," she replied, her tone quiet but heavy with meaning. "But I do know this. You're destroying yourself, and not just yourself, everyone around you." Mia felt exposed, stripped bare. She stood there, caught between Evelyn's cold, piercing gaze and the haunting silence of Stellan. Every justification, every excuse she had told herself now, felt meaningless. She was just a woman trapped, consumed by feelings she couldn't control. "Ethan will never understand," Mia said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she turned her face away. Her eyes caught the moonlight streaming through the cracks in the barn wall. "He's never understood me. Not really. And that's why you're doing this." Evelyn stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to just a few steps. "Mia, I'm not here to judge you, but you need to understand that what you're doing won't bring you the freedom you think it will. It'll only make things worse." Mia wanted to argue, to yell that Evelyn didn't understand. But how could she deny the truth in Evelyn's words? How could she ignore the reality that she had crossed a line she could never uncross? Suddenly, a noise broke through the tension, cutting through the silence like a blade. Mia froze, her head snapping toward the sound. A beam of a car's headlights swept across the field, slicing through the darkness like a razor. "Ethan!" Her heart seized, and she felt herself go cold, rooted in place. Evelyn glanced at Mia, her sharp gaze softening slightly, a glimmer of strange sympathy flickering in her eyes. "You need to decide," Evelyn said, her voice quieter now but no less resolute. "Right now, either face what you've done or sink deeper into this mess." Mia's breathing quickened as Ethan's car drew closer, the headlights sweeping across the barn wall and illuminating her pale, stricken face. She had no idea what she would say or do. She only knew that every secret, every feeling she had buried, was now teetering on the brink of exposure. Evelyn said one last time, her voice firm and unwavering, "This is your moment to choose, and only you can make that choice." Mia looked at Evelyn, then at Stellan, and finally back toward the approaching headlights. Her mind was a chaotic storm, but her heart pounded with a clarity that defied everything else, as if it were trying to guide her. In that moment, she realized she had nowhere left to run. The headlights cut sharply through the darkness, illuminating the barn door and etching every detail of Mia's anxious face into stark clarity. She stood motionless, as if time itself had stopped. Evelyn took a step back, leaving space for Mia, though she didn't leave. Evelyn's sharp eyes, usually cold and unyielding, now held a quiet, watchful patience, as though she was waiting for Mia to make her final decision. The car came to a stop just outside the barn. Ethan stepped out, his tall figure casting a long shadow under the harsh glow of the headlights. The car door slammed shut with a dry thud, and silence reclaimed the air. He hesitated, scanning the area briefly before moving toward the barn. "Mia, are you in there?" Ethan called, his voice calm as always, but to Mia it sounded like thunder crashing in the still night. She turned toward him, their eyes meeting, and in an instant she realized he knew something. Maybe it wasn't clear, maybe it was only an instinctive feeling, but he knew. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice steadier than she could manage, though the tremor in her breath betrayed her. "I just wanted to check on Stellan." Ethan stepped into the barn, his eyes moving from Mia to Evelyn, who stood a few steps away, silent and still like a shadow. His brows furrowed slightly, his gaze shifting between the two women, picking up on the unspoken tension that hung heavy in the cramped space. "Is something going on?" he asked, his tone inquisitive, his eyes probing. Evelyn didn't answer. Mia knew she wouldn't. This was her moment to face the truth, to take responsibility for everything she had desperately tried to bury. All eyes were on her now, and she felt as though every path had narrowed to a single point. She could lie again, prolong the suffocating burden of secrets and guilt, or she could confront it all, the shame, the pain, and the vulnerability she had been so afraid to face. Her gaze flickered to Evelyn, whose expression, though calm, carried an unyielding challenge, then to Ethan, whose worried eyes held a glimmer of doubt she couldn't ignore. She knew she couldn't keep running. "Ethan," she began, her voice thick with emotion. I need to tell you something." Ethan froze, his eyes narrowing slightly in confusion. He didn't interrupt or move, his gaze locked on hers. Evelyn turned her face slightly, stepping away as if to grant them privacy, though she didn't leave the barn. Mia took a deep breath, every word she wanted to say tangling in her throat. She thought of the moments she had lost herself, the times she had looked into Stellan's eyes and found the solace Ethan had never been able to give her. She thought of the yearning, the shame, the desperation, and she knew that if she didn't speak now, those feelings would imprison her forever. "I felt so alone, Ethan," she said, her voice hoarse, as tears began streaming down her cheeks. "I felt it for so long, and I don't know how to escape it. Everything with you, everything between us, it feels like it's lost all meaning." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stood there, his eyes searching hers as though trying to extract the truth behind her words. "What are you saying, Mia?" His voice was low, and she could hear the weight in every syllable. "I've been looking for comfort in a place I shouldn't have," she continued, her voice catching in her throat. "I've lost my way, Ethan. I don't know how to explain it, but I've crossed a line." Ethan stepped back, his eyes widening slightly as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Crossed a line," he repeated, his voice rough and barely audible. Mia felt her chest constrict as if her heart were being squeezed by an invisible hand. "I don't know how to explain it," she said. "I just know that I've let myself go too far, and I can't take it back." She braced herself for Ethan's anger, expecting him to yell or storm out, but he didn't. He simply stood there, looking at her with a tangled expression of emotions she couldn't decipher. Finally he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "Do you still love me, Mia?" That simple question shattered what little defenses she had left. Mia looked at him, tears streaming freely now. "I don't know, Ethan. I don't know anymore, but I want to find it again. I want to understand why we've become like this." Evelyn remained silent, but Mia could feel her presence, steady and unyielding, as she witnessed everything. Ethan turned away, stepping out of the barn without another word. His figure faded into the dim light of the car's headlights, leaving Mia standing there, emptier than she had ever felt. Evelyn approached her, her sharp eyes now softened with a strange gentleness. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Mia didn't respond. She turned toward Stellan, who still stood in the same spot, his deep, dark eyes watching her, as if they held all the answers she couldn't find. She stepped closer, her hand running gently along his mane one last time. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She had to leave the barn, leave the shadows she had allowed herself to sink into for so long. Outside, the moon continued to cast its cold glow, and in the chill of the night, Mia walked away, carrying with her all the pain, regret, and a flicker of hope that maybe one day she would find her way back to herself.